everybody, welcome back to the Enchanted Inkwell pod. I'm Michael.
I'm Britt.
And I'm Blake.
And today we're going to do a little bit of Toronto recap and then just talking about how to prep or level up your gameplay for larger events like DLCs and set championships.
Yeah, sounds great.
Yeah. So I think I'll kick us off because I wanted to talk a little bit about Toronto, right? It just happened this weekend. I find DLCs to be extremely fascinating. We know that this one wasn't exactly format warping, being that it's kind of a lame duck format. But Bucky was errated, so that changed the whole thing. And just looking at the top 8, right, I'll go over that real quick. It was Amber Emerald Under the Sea deck, which I think was made popular by Zach Bivens in Dallas. I'm sure there were a ton of other people that were working on that, in forums, etc. But he's kind of the one that put it on the map when I think he day 2'd in Dallas.
My round 7 opponent in Dallas was playing the same thing. He also day 2'd. So shout out to him if you're listening.
When you're listening.
Yeah. Second place was Amber Steel, so Steel Song, which I think everybody expected and is expecting to be sort of one of the top decks going. Sure. The next 2, 3, and 4 were actually Sapphire Steel, which is what you were on in Dallas, which I find to be very interesting. I'm really intrigued by it because the 2 decks were functionally the same, but they were definitely different, right? Like one of them had Champo, Beast, and Gaston, whereas the other one had one of the Titans. I can't remember the
Argus?
name. No, they both had Argus, right, to fight against the Flynn. But I have Pyros written on here.
Oh, the
Lava Titan.
Where when he banishes, you get to ready another character. And so I thought that was fascinating, especially going into, because the best matchup for a blue steel player was Emerald Steel.
Yes. Yeah.
And with that deck essentially being nerfed into oblivion to a degree, I find it wild that 2 of these decks were actually able to make the top 4 still.
Yeah. I mean, that is surprising to me because a lot of the reason that I played blue steel in Dallas was because I knew it had a super favorable matchup against Emerald Steel, which was kind of going to be 25 to 30% of that meta, and that was the choice. So it's pretty interesting to see that people still stuck with it, even with the Bucky errata, and then still had success with it as well.
Yeah, it just proves that it is a solid deck, right? It is a solid archetype, and I find it really interesting because you were talking about the aspect that you went into Dallas with the mindset that Emerald Steel was going to be about 30%. I think when we were kind of mocking up what we expected for that metagame, we felt that between Emerald Steel and Ruby Amethyst, that it was going to be about 60% of the field as a whole.
Yeah, that was our hunch, or that was what we were leaning on when we were.
And I believe it ended up being
pretty close,
pretty accurate.
Well, at least for my matchups, they ended up being pretty close. Okay. I ended up in 9 rounds playing 3 or 4 Emerald Steel and then 3 or 4 Ruby Amethyst. Okay. And so it was pretty good for our guess was pretty good.
Yeah.
Best deck is the deck you got CTAM on, right? Like if that's what you've been playing and you feel good about it, then what I was interrupting was it was interesting because I would be willing to bet these are not new Sapphire Steel players.
No, and I think your timing for bringing this up is fantastic because number 5 was Ruby Sapphire, our guy that has qualified 3 times now.
Amazing.
Yeah.
He's a Yu-Gi-Oh god. We are our Yu-Gi-Oh player friends. We're happy to see him do well in this DLC.
Well, and I find it very interesting too that our Yu-Gi-Oh player friends, they also prefer the Ruby Sapphire deck as well.
They sure do.
Must really speak to the Yu-Gi-Oh players. Well, if you play Yu-Gi-Oh and you've dabbled in Lorcana, is Ruby Sapphire your deck as well? We're just curious. Can we get a poll?
Can I sidebar? I'm going to sidebar. There's some diversity of TCGs going on because people are at different phases of burnout with Lorcana as a whole. And so now occasionally some of the former Yu-Gi-Oh players way back in the day are getting back into it. And I sat down with 2 of our friends. I was just having a league day and they were like, let's bust out the Yu-Gi-Oh decks. I'm done with Lorcana. And I was like, okay, I'm going to come over and have friend time. I haven't seen the 2 of you all day. I've been doing XYZ, blah, blah, blah. And I sit down and I have like pretzels in my hand, and I sit there, and they do magic. It is an arcane ritual that I do not. It defies comprehension. And I'm sitting there with my peanut butter pretzels. I last about 3 minutes. I was like, okay, guys, good hanging out. I'll see you later. And they laughed because they were like, I knew it just wasn't gonna stick. But
yeah, I definitely understand that experience when I was at one of the set championships with that group. They had gone and bought a couple boxes of Yu-Gi-Oh in order to open. And I was, just looking at, because the art's great, right? And looking at these cards, I can't even read the text. It is so small. I can't read it. So I'm asking them, it's like, well, how do you guys? And they're like, yeah, everybody just kind of makes it up. And
yeah, I think
like,
that's a joke, right?
We don't read the cards either.
Yeah, I think that's the
so
joke.
it's like, what does it do? Whatever your opponent tells you it does. That's what it does.
That's exactly what they say.
So
yeah. And they're like, and then if we think it's too shifty, we ask to read the card ourselves.
yeah. So
They're like, that seems a little too much.
bust out the magnifying glass. Here we
exactly.
go.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
I looked at them. I was like, I don't understand what any of these piles are, or what any of these cards do. And they knew and said nothing. It was just like a series of half articulations, and I was like, okay, good hanging out, guys. I'll see you later. Bye.
You have not been initiated.
I have not been. I know their arcane rituals are still foreign to me. I will have to be read into the coven at some point. It'll be great.
It'll be fun, I'm sure.
Yeah.
So the next 2 decks, 6th and 7th, were actually versions of Amethyst and Emerald. So tempo bounce. They were,
Love to see it.
again, there was variance within them. One of them had like 1-drop Maleficent and Diablo. The other one didn't have. I don't think they had either one of those, so it was more of the tempo bounce version, which was interesting. I mean, it just shows that there's space now at this point in time. It's not dominated by the same 2 or 3 decks.
I think I might have seen archetypes of those, maybe not in those exact deck lists, but Amethyst Emerald is what I'm looking at now as I'm sort of like burnt on Ruby Amethyst for a little bit. And I was struck by the same thing where I was like, oh, these are 2 very different Amethyst Emerald decks, but they both look really interesting and cool.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting. And then the 8th deck was another Amber Steel Song deck that was different again from the 2nd place, where it had Sonic Aerial in it, and it also had a copy of, what was it? Look at This Family, which I thought was an interesting, and then it also had a copy of Carefree Surfer, which I have not specifically seen in a Steel Song deck, but it definitely had like the entire song package. So it was going, which I think is very interesting, right? Not to dwell on it too much, but like going into this next meta with set 5, right? Everybody is kind of expecting Steel Song to be the top deck, but its variations are wild at this point. There's so many. There's some that are no flute at all, some that are kind of far more aggro with a song package. So it'll be really interesting to see kind of what goes. But interestingly enough, the deck that's missing, the menace itself, Ruby Amethyst was not to be seen. It did make top 16, but it did not hit top 8. And, to highlight it a little bit in the sense that it's the deck that seems to have gained the absolute least as far as what is expected. I mean, the library seems like a good possible choice, but I mean, it's competing against the Queen's Castle, which is pretty absurd.
Because it's a more mid-rangey deck, I feel like it needs to... It's one of those decks that I think needs to figure out what the other decks are doing first so that it can write in the correct answers. It could build in the correct answers, and then it'll shine, right? And so I feel like the trend that I saw in set 4 was, okay, Ruby Amethyst got chased out early on. A lot of people were doing some like cool things with the new cards and whatever. Then as time went on, and then we saw what Emerald Steel's Bucky plan was. We saw Blue Steel kind of come in, or Ruby Sapphire come in and deal with Emerald Steel. Then Ruby Amethyst was like, oh, okay, I've been lurking. Now I see what everybody's doing. Let me put in the right tools. And then it started to shine towards the end, right?
Because the bones are so solid, right?
Right,
Like just
yeah.
foundationally, it's a super solid deck. It is the fringe, like response. You're exactly right. You're like, what am I actually having to look at, and then how do we accommodate that last like 20% of the deck
Right. It's
to
like,
reflect it?
what do I need to bounce? Or like, what are the good bounce targets? Or, my Flynn Sisu Castle opening isn't the right opening. Like, what is the right opening? Right. And so I think that arguably this, even though it's the end of set 4, this Toronto itself was brand new. And so maybe RA didn't really know what to do yet. And the players just didn't pack the right tools for that. And so I think maybe like my guess, my prediction is that set 5 will kind of see the same thing. We'll see a lot of the decks that got cool tools like Naveen or Mufasa or Clarabelle. They'll start to shine first. Then once that kind of gets quote unquote solved, then our red purple will come in and say, okay, well, this is what everybody's doing. Now I know how to answer that, and now then everybody's gonna have to pivot again, and so that's the vicious cycle of a meta, right?
I saw that a little bit when we were playtesting last night, where I was playing with somebody who wants to be more proficient with Ruby Amethyst, and it was mostly a Ruby Amethyst set 4 with some edits, and I was on Amethyst Emerald, and it went wider and it went faster, but I absolutely caught myself midway through the second game, and I went, oh, I've overextended. I was like, this is absolutely what happens. Is if he would have top decked a Be Prepared when he did, I would have had no way to recover. And that like very classic mid-range Ruby Amethyst would have taken over, and I would have been cooked. And I was like, I have to play for somebody who was primarily a Ruby Amethyst player, like you just have to be a little bit smarter. But it was true that I could see that the version of the deck that's cooked right now does not have like a clear strategy against, because I was thinking of it from his perspective. I was like, how would I have played against this deck? And I was like, I don't think I figured it out. I think I need a deck list from somebody who's smarter than me to figure out what's going on here. But yeah, so any other observations about the decks in Toronto?
As far as like overall observations, not really. I think we covered what I felt like we needed to cover. The fact that Ruby Amethyst was missing was kind of a really big one, and
Sure.
I think the fact that like Blue Steel was still pretty strong. It had a great showing. Yeah. And then of course Ruby Sapphire doing his thing.
If you're walking into one of these bigger events, how do you prepare for something like that as somebody who maybe hasn't been to a DLC or hasn't been to? So the first thing is read the card, right? Know how many cards it draws, and if you can sing.
Well, it's not Yu-Gi-Oh! There's not infinite text on it, so
pretty brief.
Look, I'm pretty well known in our community to not read cards, but even I'm saying read the card, right? And I think that that's one thing that we kind of wanted to touch on today, which was, you've played your locals or you've just dived into the game and you're trying to get a little bit better. You're trying to prepare for your local constructed. You're trying to go to those enchanted tournaments or win a box tournaments, even set champions, even DLCs. And what are some things that we can do as players to improve ourselves a little bit? Nothing too hard. Nothing, like it's not just like get good, right? Right? Like,
Yeah.
But just some stuff like, so one of the big things that I had to learn coming from Magic, I felt like I was a very proficient card game player. Mm-hmm. And it was a very interesting trip to take starting a brand new card game and just being like, oh, I am clearly not playing this right, or I am not not as good of a card player as I thought I was, because I would be getting into situations at the first few locals that I went to, put together a deck and just, oh, this is not going right. I'm not winning games. I'm not even close in these games. What's going on?
It's because you're playing me. I'm just too good.
Well, and so one of the first lessons that I learned that one of our community members taught me was that the interaction is not quite the same as in Magic, right? And so questing is really important. And so there's a turn clock, learning the turn clock, learning, okay, if I do this, it's going to take me 2 or 3 turns to get to 20 uninterrupted, right? Then my opponent's going to do this, and then so who's faster? Who's who has to be on the back foot? Who's attack? Who's the aggressive player? Who's the one that's questing? Who's the one that has to answer that or slow that down? Because the turns are a little bit, there's no interaction on your opponent's turn, right? And so long story short, one of the biggest things that I had to learn is if you can put the win in a turn. So if I do this, I win next turn unless you do something. That's almost always the line of play, right?
Yes.
Like if I'm gonna win next turn, like you have to deal with this. Otherwise, I don't really have to worry unless you're gonna win next turn. I don't really have to worry about what's on your board if I can win next turn. Like make you do the thing. Yeah.
So that is such a good observation too, because I was talking to another married couple who play Magic, and we had this conversation too, I think very early in your Lorcana experience.
I mean, you probably taught me that, if we're being honest.
Maybe.
Yeah.
Where it was so different to go from Magic. In Magic, life is a resource, and you are not out until you are out and out. So if I'm winning with 1 health, I'm still winning. With Lorcana, you have to actively work towards your win condition. You have to actively quest into that end state. And what he was saying about how he was reframing things for his wife was, you just have to think of questing as doing damage in the negative. And he was like, just think of it as chipping away. But I was like, I don't know that I can, I had to reframe. It was probably our conversation that you're referring to. My favorite piece of information for contextualizing the dynamic between 2 players and what I'm doing versus what my opponent is doing came from Blake. And Blake has foundationally asked us when we were doing playtesting against each other to get you ready for DLC is, are you the aggro or are you the control in this? And if she is the aggro and you are the control, you have to play differently than if you're on the aggro. And so getting some of that dialed in was hugely helpful when it came to leveling up for competitive events.
Well, and I think specifically speaking, because I do remember that conversation. We were all a part of that conversation because
Sure.
it was part
I
of your
that lesson too.
It was part of your testing for Dallas that we were going over that. And so for everybody else's sake, you were testing blue steel, sapphire steel, and traditionally as a whole, right, that is a controlling deck. It is a control deck. And you, coming from the Magic perspective, you were very specifically thinking about it in control. You needed to control the board and then you could win. And so where you were getting hung up when we were testing against Ruby Amethyst is you were constantly just trying to control the board. Even if your opponent was having a hard time inking and putting anything on the board, you wouldn't quest. You would just try and do something to answer whatever they played, and running them out of resources because you could draw 7 new cards or whatever it was. And we had to really get you into that mind shift of well, I've got more characters and more lore on the board. I need to be turning these things sideways and going to town, right? Force them to push back on you rather than the opposite.
Right. Yeah. And so I think if I were to summarize that note, it would just be that every turn that's taken, the person who's the aggressor could possibly change, and that really changes your play style. So one of the things to note is just during the next turn cycle or whatever, to take note. Hey, am I the one that's the aggressor now? Can I be the one questing, or do I have to be the one controlling and answering? And that changes a lot more drastically than it did coming from Magic, right? That swings a lot faster. But I think that, we talked about when we were brainstorming this session, we talked about a little bit of even more basic things, right? So one thing is that when a lot of people start playing a new game, they read the rules, they understand the rules, and then they kind of just go about it. And when I play other sports or when I train for other things, a lot of people say, "Oh, practice makes perfect," right? But in reality, it's perfect practice makes perfect. If you practice your mistakes, if you practice playing poorly, if you practice bad habits, that's not going to help you in the long run. Like, you want to play as clean as possible. And Blake, I think that this is another thing that you emphasize a lot is sequencing and being very deliberate about even just the beginning of your turn, right? Ready, set, draw. And the big curveball that gets thrown in there, especially in this last set, was location Queen's Castle, right? You want to make sure that you're playing cleanly and you're lining everything up so that you don't miss your lore, so you don't get dinged for that. You don't you don't miss out on your draws for your characters that are at the location, because you want that benefit, right? And when you get into higher competitive play, not that anybody's trying to be malicious, but everybody's trying to get in the edge. And there will be people who say, "Hey, you said you're drawing for turn, so you missed your May triggers. You're not allowed to draw for your Queen's Castles anymore."
Yeah, and honestly, at a competitive level, though, it's not really even about being malicious. It's about not making mistakes, right? I mean, how many people went to any sort of tournament, whether it be set championships, a local, or a DLC, and missed a Diablo trigger, right?
If I had $1 for every time I missed a Diablo trigger,
yeah,
I
infinite
don't play
people.
Diablo, so probably about 5. But
Yeah, and because a lot of it is, you know, we've had so many sets where you would go through the motions of, this is my turn, I'm done with my turn, and then you kind of check out for a moment. They start their turn, they draw a card, and you've already missed it because you weren't paying attention.
because you're not used to interacting on your opponent's turn. We don't have instant speed interrupts. We don't have things like that. But actually, that exact point about perfect play was super important, because Blake definitely was somebody that I was looking to for that during like the Inkland set release. But something that I've shared is that I have anxiety, right? And so one of the things that I was realizing when I was having this like really difficult time testing in a competitive environment was I was getting anxious. And because I was anxious, I was having a really difficult time remembering triggers and playing cleanly and just making mistakes that I wouldn't even call dumb mistakes. I would just call them mistakes under pressure, like very easily. But I was pretty hard on myself, you know, because when you run this so many times with your friends, you're like, oh, these are stupid mistakes. And it's not stupid. Your brain is just in this like fight or flight, reaction. But what was very, very helpful for me walking into an event that I put a lot of pressure on myself for the England's set championship was that clean play thing. And going through everything methodically and literally narrating out loud. I don't care how obnoxious I sound, but if it helps me to hear myself go through my setup steps in the beginning, I will have an inner voice for, you know, my decision making when my cards are in my hand. But if it helps me to not miss 2 lore on a castle is a big deal. Mm-hmm. If it helps me not to miss a card proc or something like that, one piece of feedback that we got from another one of our friends he was our Steel Song player friend who was playing Amber Amethyst, hyper aggro. He had helped me a lot when I was like kind of like having a rough time. And he was like, no, I watched you. He was like, I stood there, I watched you. You played really clean. And that had a, like, it seems so dumb to say, but it has like such a difference on the way that you can just kind of like get settled into things. Your overall comfort level when just the more clean play structure you build into your practice, you can start to kind of account for like the brain stuff that happens when you're nervous in an event like that. It seems so dumb and elementary, but really that was something I had to have framed differently.
I wouldn't say that it's dumb at all. Specifically speaking, I would actually encourage everyone. And this isn't necessarily something that
because self-deprecation is self-harm. Don't be mean to yourself.
And this, it's not something that I specifically do, but even thinking about it, it's something that I probably should do. Announcing those starting, the starting sequencing out loud, because not only are you doing it as a reminder for you, it's actually a good way to like express to your opponent like where you're actually at within that, right? This is my ready set, and then this is my draw. And so there's no confusion as, oh, well, did you draw for turn or did you draw for beast, right?
Did you draw too many cards? Why did you draw 3 cards just now? Because I've got 2 people parked on the castle. So you don't, you're right. It eliminates that like need to be.
Yeah. So I would strongly encourage that. The other things about, perfect practice, making perfect play is, one, we talk about the sequencing. Obviously, the start of a turn is paramount important as to, the ready, set, draw. But then there's other things too, right? Making sure that your ink is visible, the amount of ink is visible to your opponent.
Let's talk about that.
Tapping it, actually tapping it. I was telling you guys, exerting.
Tapping.
That
doesn't exist.
You have to tap on it and then you exert it. Is this the one I am going to exert?
Tapping. That's the deliberation step. You're like, is this the ink? This is the ink.
Yeah. So I specifically watched, and I'm sure other people have at this point in time. I was telling you this. I've watched a popular streamer who recorded their tournament, and they had a run-in where their opponent had, I'm going to say, if I recall correctly, they had 8 ink. They didn't tap anything. They played 11 ink worth of cards.
Sure. Well, and so in a different set championship, I was sharing when we were talking about this in pre-prod was, right, the emotional connection between like your play and how you interact with people who are doing stuff like that. So by the time I got to round 5 of the Ursula's Return set championships, I was just so burnt. I was so over it. But my opponent on the other side was a Sapphire Steel player who, by all accounts, was doing everything right. But the creativity in the bookkeeping was very confusing, right? And so when you're talking about like Sapphire Steel and you're talking about, I don't know, 1 million ink on the board, I don't know why I'm looking at you accusatorily.
I feel attacked.
I feel like there's some hostility in the room right now. No, like I was like, are you doing close-up magic? Like, what are you doing, sir? And it got to the point where, so when you have like a tight community of friends or something like that, it can be uncomfy to be like, hey buddy, could you be more clear about like what you're doing and tapping your ink and stuff like that? Because you assume good intent with your opponent, right?
Sure.
This isn't like a DLC where you're getting sharked on the edge for people who can capitalize on like a misstep.
Sure. I mean, I'd like to always assume good intent, right?
Sure.
I would tend to err on the side of, hey, they might just be making an honest mistake, or
1000%.
again, like playing sloppy. But I think that that's also another thing why I would like everybody to play cleanly, and why I want to play cleanly is because you've mentioned that you deal with a lot of like anxiety internally, and it probably takes you a lot of energy to fight that, to battle through that, to play well, right? And
exhausting.
The last thing that you want to have to deal with is my opponent doing their stuff correctly.
Oh,
right?
yeah. Yeah.
And so like
I'm just trying not to have a meltdown on my side of the table. Like, do I have a creature on the table so I can play this fox, or did I forget it and pop it for a card?
Right. Right. And so you don't want to be going to the game and saying, okay, I have to worry about readying my things. Okay, my Fishbone Quill is ready. I've drawn my Queen's Castle cards, etc.
Blurple? Are we talking about this?
Whatever you might be playing, right?
I love it. It's cute.
Like everything that you've set up, and then now you've played your turn correctly, and then now you go over to your opponent, and then all of a sudden your opponent's playing like chaos, and everything's everywhere, and things aren't exerted fully or whatever, and you're now I have to think about what they're doing and trying to make sure that I'm not getting cheated. I just said that I would assume not malicious intent, but that they're not accidentally counting their ink right.
There's a
like,
misplay in their favor,
right?
Yeah.
It's just like I don't want to worry about did you do this thing? Did you not do this thing?
Right.
Can we rewind? Like, I want to worry about my cards, not your cards. And,
Right.
I'm worried about my game plan.
Right, and and I've done the thing where I'm like, I have to double. And someone's like, "How many times do you have to count the same 7 cards in front of me?" And I'm like, "Until it sticks that there's 7 of them." I promise. Like, I'm not trying to like game, but you're right, because I'm trying to, because you have to watch what's going on with your opponent. Like, there's a degree of like reading people that goes into playing against a TCG. I have had to curb my instinct to be like, well, that's dog water every time I mulligan or something like that, because my opponent's gonna be like, sweet, I'm gonna run all over you. Why not? There is that like body language part of it, and I'm trying to forecast my opponent's turn so that I know how to plan mine accordingly. Like, I'm trying to respond to the board, but I'm also trying to respond to like what's not being played, and like, if I do this, will I, kind of thing. And if my opponent is doing Sapphire Steel close-up Magic and I have no idea how many cards are on the board and stuff like that, I'm just like, how do I even?
Yeah,
I'm
it's
just
like
lost.
you
I'm confused.
You also don't want to like, okay, you're like, oh, okay, can you count that again for me? Do you actually have enough to play Whole New World and also play your dime and also play your Tamatoa and also activate it? Thank you. Like, I don't want to double check all your stuff. I don't want to be that person that's, oh, like, are you cheating me? Are you cheating me? Like that. Mm-hmm. Obviously, that doesn't make the other player feel great. So
no, yeah, it's a weird ding to your sportsmanship,
right? So
feeling.
So I think that's going back to Blake's point. Is just if everybody plays cleanly, right, and the announcing your things, like announcing the things not only help you but help your opponent keep track. Okay, hey, this is where stage happens, right? And I was guilty of this when we were playtesting, but ready. It's like I would ready all my characters, and then I would start my turn, and then all of a sudden, oh, my Fishbone Quill's still exerted. Like, did I use it this turn? Did I not? Like, what happened? Like,
right,
I forgot to, like, even that. Just take a breath, take a notice of all your, your surroundings, and then just do everything. And I think that also, back to what you're saying is like, hey, it may seem tedious to announce it, but also at the same time, it becomes sort of a muscle memory if you can ingrain it in yourself, right? I equate this back to when I was younger. I played a lot of piano, and I would play in a lot of recitals and would have to memorize a lot of music. Yep. And at some point, it's not active memorizing music anymore. My fingers are just going, and you're just like, oh, like, I don't know how this happened. I don't know how this got here, but
it's like driving on autopilot. You're like, I'm in my driveway. I hope it didn't run any lights.
Right? It's a little bit like that. Your muscle memory kicks in, and now because you've practiced it properly, you don't have to worry about the missteps that might have come up, right?
Right. And that especially was important for me because I was primarily like an online tester to a degree, right? Where some of that administrative stuff was taken care of for me. And I've noticed that other people, when they transition into paper versions of these card games, it's like, oh, all of that stuff, which was really nice to have like MTG Arena automate it for me or something like that. That doesn't happen anymore in paper, and like I have to do it. So yeah, so the stress of like, oh, did I remember to take have I inked for this turn? Like that's the classic one, right? Is did I ink for this turn? And like having to count and go, I'm this many turns in, I've drawn this many cards. And like, it's embarrassing. Like you don't want to, like the person across from you is like, get your act together. And I'm like, I'm trying. I promise this is the best version of me showing up right now. So like the strategies of like figuring out, and that in hand management too, right? Like that's another thing that can cause stress and anxiety is when all of the cards are face down on the thing, I put my hand off of the mat. I don't know. Matt uses a hand keeper, a little gachapon figurine that I got him, but I keep mine just like off to the side. So there's never face down cards on the mat that aren't ink.
Oh, I just put my cards face up so you can see what they are.
Oh,
Like,
sweet.
this
No
is
wonder I was
clearly-
winning.
Yeah.
No
this
wonder.
Is,
Yeah.
this is where my
Oh,
cards
no,
are.
could you fan those out a little? How many hands are in that stack?
Yeah, this is my hand, right? You can see this. This is my hand.
I have done that in a competition. I put my hand down and I was like, "That's a fox." I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, I understand that. That hand management specifically is probably one of the things I think about the most when I'm playing, especially because I play a variety of decks, and sometimes you just have so many things on your play mat that you're like, where do I put this? That's a safe place, you know. And
Top of your head.
I think that's
Back pocket.
yeah. It's you put it somewhere, but I think the other thing too, though, is that if it ends up being somewhere where maybe not the best place, like just knowing that, like, look, I'm not trying to cheat anybody, but I usually try and put it more in the play area. So it's like, my hand is up where the characters are. There's no reason why I would put my ink there when I very clearly have all my ink laid out nicely underneath, where it belongs.
We have friends who do tokens. What do you think about the token
Hate it.
I feel like I get discombobulated.
Are you saying the representative?
Yes.
The
card token.
Card?
Yeah.
We touched about this a little bit. I think is I don't want another thing to have to worry about. Like, again, mentally keeping my brain clear, trying to play the game to the best of my ability. I don't want to have to worry about another pile of cards if I don't have to. Hey, I ink this, and then at the end of the turn, I switch this out and whatever. Like, that's just another step that I personally don't want to have to deal with.
Sure.
Well, and I think game management, as far as time is concerned, right? That's something that has been a problem in the past, where people are going to time. Now you're adding one more step every time you're inking. You're having to do this extra thing.
Yeah.
So I don't particularly like that. I don't like the token that slides across them because, again, somebody
What if it gets bumped?
somebody that maybe is a little bit malicious with it. And I've never experienced this in Lorcana specifically, right? So it's not something where it's like, oh, I got burned and so now I just hate it.
Must be nice.
Right. I just think that ultimately play the game the way it's supposed to be played. There are certain additions that could be added, right? You were talking about, did I ink this turn? I think that it should be written into the rules. If it hasn't already been written into the rules, you ink face up.
I like that a lot.
I think the other thing that I like about it too is it stops you from having to be like, oh, what did you ink? Because they do the quick little like, oh, I'm inking this, and then they put it down, and it's like they're trying to hide what they're inking. It should be obvious. What did you ink this turn? And it shouldn't be this like second blip of like, oh, I inked this.
So
counterpoint.
You go.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Sorry.
no, you go. No.
Counterpoint. We're probably talking about the same thing.
Sure.
We had this conversation in Discord fairly recently, right? Where it was, should writing be allowed in Lorcana? Is this, from an EDI lens, is this fair to people who need this information written down for whatever equity lens like that is appropriate for them? Or is retaining the information of what your opponent has inked a fundamental skill aspect of this game, where discard does not apply because you can check the discard at any time?
So this is interesting because I think it touches on two different aspects. One, the note-taking aspect as a whole.
Right.
And as you brought up the equity aspect, I've been pretty obvious with you guys about, I 100% think that notes should be allowed in general, right? You should be able to note specifically what gained you that 2 lore, what gained you that 3 lore, how did you go from being at 12 to 15? And that way, if something comes up where, well, I have you at 12, well, no, I'm at 15, you can be like, I quested with this,
Right.
Certain aspects of the game should be allowed, especially when you're talking about the fact that this is supposed to be an all ages, for the most part, all ages family friendly game. You can't expect an 8-year-old to remember as well as a 28-year-old, right? Like, one of these people has a completely like fully developed frontal cortex. The other one does not, right? Like, so I think from that perspective, yeah, I think from that perspective, I think notes should be allowed. But then to kind of go back to what we were talking about, where you're swapping out, cards for ink at that point in time, it is another step that takes time away from being able to play the game. So I'll say that. secondarily, I would say in the note-taking realm,
Right.
I would not allow note-taking of the Inkwell.
So, interesting thing to bring up is that in the rule book, I'm 90% sure that you can actually write down what gained you the lore. I believe it's in the rules specifically that you can write down, you are allowed to keep track of lore and how it was gained. So you could say, okay, +2 Daisy quest, +1 or +2 the new card that just gets you 2 lore. I'm pretty sure that that is allowed in the note-taking aspect. All other notes are not allowed. Hey listeners, Michael here. This is actually incorrect information. We found out later that the rules only allow you to keep track of the numbers of lore gained, basically. So don't take additional notes as they are currently against the rules. Sorry about that.
But no, but going back to what I was saying, not to interrupt you, but going back to what I was saying about is this like fundamentally a skill issue in Lorcana. Oh, damn. My brain. Oh, that's what it was. I'm a star, baby. If you are inking face up, right? Is it different? Is it helping your opponent when you're also helping yourself? Because is somebody going to go, oh, I forgot what Blake inked at the beginning of this turn. It was a valid inking target, but now I don't remember how many Tamatoas he's inked. So is it giving them an advantage by leaving it face up the entire time?
To a degree, but in so many matches, it's irrelevant, right? Like it's not what they're inking. What they should be inking are cards that are not really crucial to this matchup specifically. Like in an ideal world, they should be inking cards that are not going to help them win the match against you. Now we understand that that's not always the case, right? You're going to have to ink what you got to ink because you've got to ink, right?
Right.
So we understand that there's that aspect of it, but I think fundamentally it is going to give them that little bit of an advantage. But if they can't remember the first 4 inks, like what does it matter this 1 ink? But what it does do is it stops both you and your opponent, if they're also doing it, from inking twice, which is 100% like even worse.
Right. And I think it was popularized maybe by the DLC streams or something.
I think they had initiated it during the Atlanta stream, but it never became.
We thought it was like mandated for a second because of how common it was.
At one point in time, yes, when we were watching matches that were on stream, it very much so felt like somebody would play a card and then a judge would tell them, hey, flip it over, like show that ink. So I feel as if it's good enough for the stream, it should be a good enough for like the entire
like best
game.
practice.
And I think it's just a wonderful rule, and it helps everyone avoid a mistake that they should not be making.
Yeah, I think at Dallas when I was playing, a lot of my opponents did that. I've adopted that as a habit where, the ink for the turn, especially because I play blue steel as previously specified. There's a lot of, okay, bells down. Yes, here's my second ink, fishbone quill. Okay, this is now fully upside down, but like I still have my ink for the turn because there's no face up card in my Inkwell, right? And, before I do whole new world, all this kind of stuff, like things get chaotic on my turns. And so that has helped me a lot to make sure that I don't double ink. And then it's good to, hey, I passed the turn, then I flip it over, and then we're all good, right? So I think that that's a pretty helpful tip. I think that is also really good, just to keep track, a clean play, a good way to clean play, not have double ink, like you said. And maybe it should be written officially into the rules, but I feel like a lot of people have started adopting it already, at least as far as I can tell at the higher levels.
So yeah, you're right. You know, at the end of the day, what we're really trying to focus on at this point in time is getting better at clean play. And I think one of the aspects of clean play that in order to warp, you know, get your mind wrapped around, right, when we talk about, you know, who's the beat down, who's the control, one of those aspects, and we did bring it up a little bit earlier, is really it's about mitigating mistakes, both yourself and your opponent's mistakes. And so once you're able to do that, really the opponent, you know, whoever in the matchup is going to make the least amount of mistakes is most likely going to be the person that wins. There are certain other factors that can, you know, go against that. But ultimately, at the end of the day, when you're showing up at a competitive level event, the idea is you want to make as few mistakes as humanly possible.
Yeah, you cede whatever advantage you might have had by just making like easily preventable kind of mistakes. And then you also have the ability to focus on the stuff that's super important, which is your strategy, when you're not like having to do some fumbling around for things that you can just build into your practice as like best practices, that kind of thing. So really, more than like upping your game, it's just like these are like really easy things to think about when you're doing your practice, getting ready for these events.
Right. And interestingly enough, to kind of go back a little bit, it's one of the reasons why we even started this podcast is because we were having these types of conversations when we were testing with Michael. And we realized, hey, maybe this is something we would like to share with other people, right?
Yeah, maybe it's helpful.
You know, and we had talked about like your previous experience with Magic, where it was like everybody, you know, the idea of somebody got there and they just had to get beat up on before they just get good, right? Whereas like we have a community that sits down and says, hey, look, like if you want to get better, it's fine. We'll teach you what we know, right? And that is in kind of like the last little bit of strategy for this episode that I would want to talk about, which is find other players, find better players than you, and be friends with them, play with them, ask them questions, because most people, especially in this game specifically, are more than willing to go out of their way to help you out, to help you improve their game, because in doing so, it will almost always help them improve their game.
Yeah. I'll sign in, or I'll check in with exactly what I just had a conversation with one of our like store champion friends who I've leaned on for help in the past, where I was like, you know, like I don't want to waste your time. You know, I don't want to, you have significant skill. You are very kind. You are generous with your information. I want to do well because I don't want this to be a waste of time for you. And he goes, Britt, like if you're just making better decisions in the moment in a match, then it's time well spent, because at the end of the day, like having a community, having friends that have an investment in your play beyond just, you know, competitive matches. I recognize that is a luxury, right? Like not everybody has the game store that we have. Not everybody has the pool of friends that we do. I'm not trying to like flex on people who don't have access to that, but that is really good advice. And if you don't have that community, is this an opportunity for you to grow that community and to do it like mindfully in a way that, what is it? A rising tide raises all ships, or steel sharpens steel.
Absolutely.
That's the perspective.
Slime's slimier, right?
We're still workshopping that
Slime's
one.
getting
You're doing
slimier.
Great. You're doing great, Mike.
I thought I had it.
You're doing great.
Oh man.
Well, this was a great conversation, guys. Thanks for hanging out with us again tonight while we're talking about some of these things.
Yeah. Thanks for hanging out.
Yeah.
And I think we'll be talking about other aspects of this, you know, as we grow together as well, right?
Yeah, for sure. We have hours and hours of droning on about things that Blake needed to drill into my head when I was trying to get better, and still trying to get better. No, I mean, we have so much to talk about. It's just we can't do it in one session, and you wouldn't want to listen to us do it in one session.
This is just the bite size. I feel like this is good. If there's anything that anybody ever has like a question about, you know, like what kind of questions do you have when you're preparing for an event like this? You know,
hit us up in the comments, questions that you would want us to answer, or things that you have trouble with, and maybe we have you know, some tips for you on that.
If you're on Spotify or Apple Music, you're gonna have to Google our YouTube channel. But yeah, exactly. Yeah, hit
You
us
can
up.
hit our socials.
We would love to have a conversation and grow our community beyond like the physical one that we have going on, so we can help. Yeah. Awesome. Okay, guys. Well, that's it for tonight.
Yeah. We'll see you next week.
We'll see you next week.
Thanks for watching.
Bye.